All right, welcome to the conversation. We've got a great guest for you guys, old friend, wonderful progressive, former president and CEO of the NAACP. He's also at the Mississippi Jackson Advocate, the executive director of the National Newspaper Publishers Association. That'll be relevant later in the conversation. And he's ran for governor of Maryland as the Democratic nominee. I can go on all day long. It's Ben Jealous. Ben, thanks for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Cenk. It's good to be
Yeah.
here.
So, Ben, we're going to talk about Biden's VP pick possibility. Progressives are trying to figure out who in the world they should support, given the situation, and it's a very, very tough situation. And I know that you're backing Stacey Abrams, and that's why I want to talk to you about why you're doing that, and it's so important and interesting. But obviously, the events that have happened recently has me starting with George Floyd and what happened in Minneapolis first. And so, let's start with the event itself before we get to what has happened since then. So, Ben, I've now been covering this for 18 years. One African American man killed after another, unarmed by police. And so we never fix it, and people are beginning to lose hope that we're ever going to fix it. So how do you think it can be fixed, and what needs to be done by people empowered to fix it?
We have to understand that we're dealing with something that is centuries old. It really goes into a deeper tribalism in our psyche. I've been involved in this fight my entire life. I can remember my grandfather was a black law enforcement officer in Baltimore talking to me about the terror that he lived with, afraid that one of his colleagues might mistake him for a threat because he operated in plainclothes. And the reality is that if we're going to change things, we've got to go deep. When it comes to law enforcement, yes, we need all of the body cameras and community policing. We also have to change the way that we train people. In England, where most of the officers do not carry a gun, they are trained every 6 months on when to escalate force and, most importantly, how to de-escalate situations. In our country, where the standards vary across more than 16,000 different law enforcement agencies, the most common standard is you get trained once in force escalation, one day, like 9 to 5 at the academy, and that's it. And then after that, as they say, it's training day. And you're really trained by a culture that, if we're honest, has its roots in slave patrols. And so we have to, in a decisive way, decide that we're going to build our police to operate in a way that is appropriate for our democracy, that is appropriate for a country that is rapidly becoming more diverse, and that is frankly appropriate for all of our sense of morality. And I can remember being with Bernie Cenk in 2016 and wondering if folks in the Ozarks really understood how bad all of this was when we saw all of those men, including in Minneapolis. Back then it was Philando Castile, killed on our TV screens. And there was a moment when Bernie put out the call for the police to stop killing unarmed black women and unarmed black men. And in the Ozarks, people jumped in their seats, put up their fists and hollered, jumped up on their seats, put up their fists and hollered support. And like half the men were in deer hunting camouflage. And so this is not really a racial issue. You can go right back to the founding of our country, to the Boston Massacre, where that Paul Revere painted out Crispus Attucks, the first American killed in the Boston Massacre, a young black man who abolitionists later painted back in. There's been a multiracial fight to end police brutality that's at least as old as the redcoats in this country. And we just need to finally win it. And we have to understand that means that we're going to have to change the way that policing is done. We need more officers with college degrees. We need more women. We need more training. We need, quite frankly, to be smarter about training people to de-escalate situations. We need to use violence interrupters more. There's a whole raft of changes. One of the places I think that's done the best job at making incremental progress is New York City, where they passed through a raft of these changes about 5 or 6 years ago. And the good news is that they saw violence go down for years as a result. And so let us not for a second believe that you have to have abusive cops in order to be safe. You don't. In fact, they actually make all of us less safe.
Yeah, violence begets violence. And so, look, I love every part of what you just said. I've been saying for I don't know how many years in a row, for God's sake, retrain the police. There's something wrong with the culture. Excessive force is almost taught and by regular process, and unfortunately now woven into the DNA of the culture of policing in this country. So that leads me to the next question, which is, look, I get it. The Republicans are never going to do it. Never. I'm not even having that conversation. I think that they actually, guys like Trump, but, now Trump is the Republican Party, revel in, he said it. He said it in a tweet on Thursday night. He said, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. That's an old saying from 1967 from a police department in Miami. It was known for being horribly abusive to African Americans, and they said that as a way of in celebrating police brutality, and that cop had that reputation, the leader of the cops there down in Miami. You get it. But I want to talk about the Democrats because, look, I don't want to be unfair. That's why I gave that prelude about, yes, the Republicans are never going to fix this. But when Democrats are in power, as Barack Obama was, are they doing enough? And I don't say that just to look back. I'm talking about going forward. If Biden wins, no matter who his VP is, I'm not at all convinced that they're going to have the courage to say, no, that's it. We're retraining all the police. The culture is wrong. What's your take on whether the Democratic Party has done enough and how we can push them to do more?
We absolutely have to build a Democratic Party that listens to and is led by its youngest members. The reality is that this is the century when we become a democracy truly by necessity, because it will no longer be possible for one group to dominate our politics demographically. And our young people get this in their bones. And on every issue, whether it's healthcare or it's education or it is policing, they have a clear vision for a better future for all of us. And on this issue, quite frankly, too many generations of Democratic politicians have been trained that you can be a liberal on everything except for law enforcement. That if you want to win, this is how Feinstein won back in the day. That if you want to win, you got to outright the right on law enforcement. And so we have Democrats who are, quite frankly, too patient with the status quo, want to make up too many excuses, and want to act like it's the impatience of the protesters that's the problem, rather than the injustice in our justice system. We also have to be clear that in some cases, though, laws have to be changed. The Fraternal Order of Police has been very good at whittling away on all kinds of protections for citizens in order to make it harder to prosecute bad cops. Let me be clear. I come from a law enforcement family. I have law enforcement family members who picked up a gun and a badge and went to work today. They do great work. They are heroes. They risk their lives every day. No one endangers their lives more than members of law enforcement who are themselves corrupt, abusive, and violent. And so we have to be clear that everybody has an interest in cleaning things up. Starts, unfortunately, with Democratic politicians having courage. And as you and I both know, there's too many of us who have courage on everything except for taking on law enforcement.
Yeah. So now you mentioned the reaction, and we're talking on Friday. This will air a couple of days later, but we had peaceful protests. Then we had police firing rubber bullets and tear gas, and then yes, there definitely fires and some looting, and they took over the 3rd Precinct police station, and that was lit on fire. So, of course, the reaction of the right wing is, we knew it. Look at these African Americans doing the rioting. It's their fault. My reaction is, well, if you give violence is basically a politics of last resort. And I've said a million times on the show, we should never go there. It's never going to work out for us. The right wing will always out-violence us, and it's immoral, and I can go on and on. But to me, the people that are responsible are the ones that never fixed the system in the first place,
Yeah.
making this inevitable. I wanted to know what your take was.
Well, look, Trump came out and tried to pin this all on the mayor of Minneapolis, which is outrageous. The best way to control a situation like this would have been to charge the cops, and the only jurisdiction that has no way of doing that is the city. The county has a major role to play. The state can play a role too. The federal government absolutely can bring charges. No one has faith that Donald Trump's Justice Department will do that. It was even hard, quite frankly, and there were frustrations when Obama was in office about not bringing federal charges against George Zimmerman. And so we have to understand that in this moment, it really takes leadership, and the strongest places for leadership in this type of situation will be the county prosecutor's office and the U.S. Department of Justice. Trump has short-circuited the U.S. Department of Justice. That means it will all pretty much fall in that county prosecutor's office. And they need to bring charges. They cannot, I'm from Baltimore. They try to say, oh, look at Freddie Gray. With all due respect, Freddie Gray was killed in a van. There was no videotape. This man was killed on the street. There was plenty of videotape. This is a much easier case to bring, and it's urgent that it be brought.
I mentioned your journalism background before, and you're now a visiting scholar at the Annenberg School at University of Pennsylvania. But you also were involved in an app, Citizens Act, that actually could be very relevant in protests like this. So what is that, Ben?
Sure. So the Citizen app is an app that's active now in about 20 cities, including the Twin Cities. We were built in New York City, where a quarter of the folks have, a quarter of the people in the city have downloaded the app. And what we do is we allow you, if you're within a few hundred feet of an incident that's been reported on 911, to live stream what you're seeing. And so if folks want to see what's happening from the eyes of the protesters and people who are in the crowds, you can simply go to the Citizen app and download it, and then just flip over to what's happening in Minneapolis and see what's happening right now. One of the reasons why we brought the app to Minneapolis, and to back up, the main function is it sends real-time 911 notifications to your phone, and then it allows you to document what you're seeing if you're on the scene. One of the reasons we brought it was to empower people in situations involving the police to monitor what the officers are doing. The app has lots of other values. It notifies you when there's a fire or a missing person, or there's been shot fired in your neighborhood. But we have seen officers change their behavior when somebody's holding up their camera and says to them, "Officer, I just want to let you know that 250 people in the neighborhood are watching you right now." And we literally have seen our officers change their behavior 180 degrees when it's clear that they're being recorded, and quite frankly, not on a device that they could just take from the person. Because if you record it on our platform, it's all on our platform.
So Vice President Joe Biden is now the Democratic nominee, and he's got to pick his own vice president. So the top contenders appear to be Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, Stacey Abrams, and Amy Klobuchar and Gretchen Whitmer. And there's others, but those are the five that are most often mentioned. Given what's happened in Minnesota and the prosecutorial history of Klobuchar, I don't know if she's still in the top five. But people often talk about how he has to pick a African-American female VP. But that seems to wash away the differences between Kamala Harris and Stacey Abrams as if they're the same person. Obviously, they are not. So you're backing Stacey Abrams. Why is that?
Well, let me just acknowledge that was a tough choice. And the first three women that you mentioned, any of them, I think, would be a great vice president. I don't know the other two so well, and I do have concerns about Klobuchar and her history in her state. Stacey, to me, is a unique person in my life and a unique person in this country. I've noticed since we were 20-year-old organizers taking on the governor of Mississippi, who was trying to turn a black college into a prison, along with Derek Johnson, who runs the NAACP nationally now, and we beat him. And Stacey comes from a family, a civil rights family. Her father was a leader in Hattiesburg when he was a teenager, when that city was right at the kind of crosshairs and the crossroads of the future of the civil rights movement. and he raised Stacey to be just as courageous. And I saw her do things when I was president of the NAACP, and she was the first woman to ever lead a legislature in Georgia, and she was in her early 30s. I saw Stacey do things that were incredible, considering that the Republicans had control of the government. I saw her create consensus to save the union when other leading Democrats had betrayed the union that represents the bus drivers in Atlanta and the subway operators. She actually built bipartisan consensus to save them. I saw her work with the Republican governor to push through, at the time, the most sweeping state level criminal justice reforms that we have ever seen. And I have seen Stacey again and again, with humility and compassion, take the concerns of working people and deliver real results. All of this in Georgia. And so we need somebody, when this country is so fractured, who knows how to reach across the aisle and pull folks towards us to win major progressive victories. We're fools if we think as progressives that we can get everything we want done by ourselves. Those of us, like me and Stacey, have worked on criminal justice reform for the last quarter century or more of our life, know that we can work to get sweeping criminal justice reform done because we've done it together at the state level. And we've done it with Republicans who we disagree with on 99 things, but found the one thing we could agree on, which was that our prisons are destroying families. They understand it often because they're involved in right-wing ministries that are operating behind bars, and they know the human damage just like the NAACP knows the human damage of over incarceration. Stacey's an incredible bridge builder who has won real progressive reforms in Georgia, in the Georgia legislature with a Republican governor, precisely because she is a courageous organizer who grew up in the civil rights movement.
I hear from some progressives that they're worried about Stacey Abrams precisely because of those things. They say she's perhaps a secret moderate because of her history of being able to work with Republicans and get legislation that at the end of the day was not as progressive as people would have liked. How do you answer that, Ben?
There were always folks in the North who thought that Martin Luther King was too moderate and that he should have adopted the rhetoric of Malcolm X. The reality is Martin Luther King was in Georgia and Malcolm X was in Harlem. And those are universes apart. Stacey is absolutely committed to changing people's lives for the better in real time because she comes from the very communities. Stacey grew up in places like Wiggins, Mississippi. Most progressives I know haven't been to Mississippi, let alone to Wiggins. But she grew up right on the front lines of poverty in this country. And so, like Martin Luther King before her, she operates in a way that is distinctly Southern. And like Martin Luther King before her, she is absolutely rooted in serving poor people. And like Martin Luther King before her, the change she would bring to our country would be tremendous. We have to, as progressives, learn to appreciate the geographic differences of this country and the different sort of rhetoric and manner of behavior that we have to take on when we're operating in a place like Georgia and, not in, say, New York City.
The establishment critique I see of Stacey is that, well, she's untested. We don't know her well enough. It's too much of a wild card to pick someone that the nation doesn't know well enough and that hasn't served in a big enough office. Well, what's your take on that, Ben?
How can you sit there and discount the only woman in the history of the country to pull together a coalition and lead a party in the Georgia legislature? How can you discount a leader, a Democrat, who got as much done as she did? And how can you pretend like, frankly, President Obama had? He began running for president the day he became senator. And I don't think he even finished his first term. And what Stacey did and has done in her state legislature is at least as significant as what he did in his. Now, we've seen great leaders rise up from state legislatures to lead in the White House, going way back. Stacey is right in that mold. She is brilliant, and we would be lucky to have her as vice president. We'd be lucky to have her as president.
I want to call out what you recently did in Baltimore. You raised $1 million for people that are dealing with coronavirus in Baltimore right now. How did you do that, and where does it go?
It was inspired by the Unite Here union, whose leader in Baltimore called and told me that in 2 weeks, 90% of her members would be laid off. My grandfather supported our family, his daughter, my mom, his wife, my grandmother, as a unionized dishwasher. And I thought for 1 second what might have happened to our family if he had lost that job. And honestly, there was a lot of good that may not have ever occurred. So I sent out a note to friends, and we celebrated checks coming in that were as small as $3, $2.50. And then the checks just got bigger and bigger and bigger. It kind of went through the roof. And all of a sudden, we had hoped to raise $10,000. We ended up raising over $1 million. We're giving that money to Black churches, to Casa de Maryland, which serves the undocumented, and to relief funds for union workers who find themselves out of work, and to help school children get computers. It's just a tremendous act of grace, and it reminds us that in these tough times, all of us are wise to remember the grace that's been shown to our families in tough times, and to pay it forward by showing grace to others.
In the description box below, if you're watching this later on the big platforms, YouTube, Facebook, we'll put the links to all the things that Ben mentioned in case you want to participate as well. Benjamin Jealous, former head of the NAACP, current visiting scholar at Penn. Thank you so much for joining us. Really, really appreciate it.
Thanks for watching this free clip of the Young Turks. Don't forget to become a TYT member today. For more exclusive content, join now at tyt.com/join.